Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 224. This week the questions are taken from guide 264, the guide to HMS St. Lawrence, and also the Wednesday video on the US Navy's Pacific submarine campaign for the dark year, December 41 through December 42. So let's begin. Theobald Doucet asks, you mentioned in the video that HMS St. Lawrence was the subject of an attack from an early prototype of torpedo or mine. Do you have any more details on this strange hybrid, or has all information been lost to time? A reasonable amount of detail remains to us, but it's not a particularly great amount because, to be honest, the weapon itself was not particularly complicated. The idea was for a small group of people to get a small boat, which obviously could then be rowed into what was at the time Kingston Harbour, under the cover of darkness, hopefully without being noticed, and with them was a weapon that was effectively, what is the biggest barrel we can reasonably make watertight? Let's get that, let's fill it with gunpowder, let's stick a fuse on it and a harpoon with some rope, and the idea was then that this would be taken into position by the rowboat, the crew of which would then jab the harpoon into the side of the ship to make sure the keg didn't go anywhere, light a slow fuse, and then retire at haste, presumably hoisting some sort of sail once they got to an appropriately safe distance to get away before the massive barrel of gunpowder blew up and hopefully blew a hole in the ship's side, thus sinking it. The only downside to this highly dangerous enterprise was, of course, the fact it relied on your ability to sneak into Kingston Harbour in a rowed boat that had a collapsible mast and sail whilst carrying, several hundred kilos of gunpowder, and it turned out that this was much easier imagined than done because the British patrols, who were looking for general sabotage missions, although probably not expecting necessarily this particular kind, spotted the boat and chased it away before it could get into the harbour, and thus St. Lawrence was saved. Brian Nicholas asks, where and how did the British get the materials to actually build the St. Lawrence? I can see timber, Canada and the US were full of it after all, but 60 plus 32 pounders and the secondary armament, etc., it's hard to imagine that the colony of Canada had all those guns just sitting around, never mind all the fixtures and fittings. Well, the simple answer was that they didn't have all the necessary equipment. They were able to manufacture such equipment in smaller quantities, and obviously there was a certain amount you could bring in by ship from the UK as well, which is how the various frigates and other ships had been equipped in the previous year's campaigns on the Great Lakes. But when it came to St. Lawrence, they didn't have first-rate scale yard arms and sails and cannons and all the other bits and pieces. So what they did, bearing in mind that this is right towards the end of the War of 1812, which means that the Napoleonic Wars are kind of winding down, they had a number of third rates which were present on the east coast of Canada, and they actually disarmed them and removed a bunch of their fixtures and fittings and then took them partly up by barge and partly over land, all the way to the Great Lakes, where they were then fitted to the St. Lawrence. So you actually ended up with a bunch of partially disarmed, partially dismantled third rates sitting on the east coast of Canada, with all of their equipment having gone into St. Lawrence, and some of the other ships that were in the process of being constructed for what would have been the next year's campaign. Martin Zeidler asks, how much faster would the 1930s and 1940s warships have been had today's understanding of hydrodynamics been applied to their hull designs at the time? In particular, the use of bulbous bows, etc. Could significantly greater speeds and or reductions in machinery sizes have been possible, or are the differences somewhat negligible? There could be some advances, however, the idea of a battleship's hydrodynamic form underwater was a relatively advanced science by the 1930s, 1940s. I mean, the Froude tank testing had been going on for quite a while. Now, what you might have been able to do if you had modern techniques and the modern understanding of hydrodynamics would have been to identify some of the slightly weirder things, like the vibration and resonance issues the North Carolinas had, although, as I mentioned in previous Drydock, that kind of would need also modern computational abilities. There are a number of issues that are kind of separate to our modern understanding of hydrodynamics. So, for example, if you take the US fast battleships, the North Carolinas, South Dakotas, and Iowas. Now, the South Dakotas, their hull form was constrained by the fact you had to have them at 35,000 tons with the required armour and firepower. This is why they were shorter than the North Carolinas. It's not ideal for speed, but it's a design consideration they had to live with. The Iowas were obviously free of that consideration and could be very, very much faster. However, all three were still limited to what at the time was the Panamax beam width. So there were compromises made in their hydrodynamic form because they had a limited beam. And if you can understand hydrodynamics as much as you like, but if you have to compromise the underwater hull form for an exterior consideration, you're never going to get quite the perfect form. Now, obviously, if you allow them to ignore the Panamax restrictions, then applying modern design techniques to the underwater forms of their hulls will obviously result in an amount of savings. But you also have two major structural features which you could incorporate, one of which was mentioned in the question, the bulbous bow, and the other one is the transom stern, which we did see in Vanguard. Now, if you combine a bulbous bow and a transom stern, plus a hull form that's not constrained by having to go through the Panama Canal, and run that through a modern hydrodynamic simulation, then you will probably get a ship that can, for a given amount of power, move reasonably faster than its World War II equivalent, or move at the same speed with somewhat smaller machinery. But apart from the constraints of now not being able to fit through the Panama Canal, you're going to also face a number of other constraints, because the bulbous bow works by creating destructive interference with the bow wave. But that only works in a specific speed regimen, and can actually make the ship less efficient at other speed regimens. Similarly, the transom stern has advantages when it comes to manoeuvring and just sailing at higher speeds, but it also has disadvantages at lower speeds. So if you were configuring your ship to be as efficient as you possibly could get it at high speed, then yeah, sure, non-Panamax constrained, bulbous bow, transom stern, modern hydrodynamics, you'd get a ship that could move a few knots faster for the same power, or dramatically drop its power requirements for the same speed. But you'd pay for that in other areas of its operation, so it wouldn't be as efficient at cruising, for example. Or alternatively, if you configured the ship to be really efficient cruising at 12, 14 knots or so, then it's not going to be quite as good at the top speeds that you might need it to go at in battle. So everything is a little bit of a compromise, and that hasn't really changed today. Albeit that I suppose if you really want to push the boat out with really cutting-edge 2022 hydrodynamics, you could also put in I don't know what the best way to explain it, because the company that was displaying it earlier this year was Dutch, and they've got a Dutch name for it. But effectively, if you imagine a car's spoiler, that is at the back and presses it down, you can, as it turns out, also fit one of those on the underside of a ship at the back to create basically an underwater hydrofoil, a lifting plane, which gives you power savings and efficiency savings at higher speeds, because it tends to lift the back of the ship out of the water, whereas running at speeds tends to drop the back of the ship into the water. So, that would also be a considerable saving, but again, it would combine perhaps with a transom stern and a bulbous bow, etc., to give you a really, really nice top speed efficiency, but would potentially, depending on its configuration, again have negative influences at lower speeds, because it is additional weight that you have to haul around apart from anything else. So yeah, with the perfect combination, you could probably greatly increase the feature that you wanted, whether that be cruising or top speeds, albeit that I get the feeling that given the amount of weight that you're saving, along with space for machinery, most designers, except for maybe the ones who are designing the Iowas, would probably choose to just minimize the machinery space, etc. They'd be quite happy with going at 28 knots and use all that extra weight for either more armament or more armor or both. Whereas obviously someone who's designing something that's supposed to be fast, like Iowa or Vanguard, would probably still want to increase protection a little bit, but would probably, exploit the features for a bit more speed as well. Steve Valley asks, while researching the cost of converting Jupiter into a carrier, I found that the 1919 appropriation bill that funded that project also had money for investment in Zeppelins. $1.5 million was to be invested in building Shenandoah, $2.5 million for buying R-38 from the UK, and $3.7 million to build 2 hangars for them. A total of $7.7 million invested in Zeppelins versus $500,000 invested in converting Jupiter into a carrier. Was there reasonable evidence at the time for Zeppelins having more potential for the Navy than carriers? Well, there's 2 factors to take into account, one of which is that Jupiter being converted into Langley is, of course, basically a topside conversion. The expensive work of, buying and installing all of the machinery, building the hull, because of course this is not a warship, it doesn't have a main battery of guns, etc., in its collier form at least. All of that has been done, so the conversion work is going to be cheaper than building or buying an airship outright, because that's a complete ground-up construction. So if you want an airship or two in that time period, it's going to cost considerably more than it would to convert a collier. But with that said, yes, there's still a lot of money being thrown around, and for the costs involved and for the capabilities involved, it would seem in the very late 1910s, early 1920s, that airships might offer more than carriers did at that time, because you've got to remember that, well, in 1919 the US Navy does not have any torpedo bombers capable of being launched from carriers or otherwise, so they've only got aircraft that in theory can be launched from the carrier when it's completed, which can only carry very small bombs. Otherwise, if you want anything larger, you're going to have to rely on land-based aircraft, and a land-based aircraft, even a big one like a Martin NBS-1, still has a relatively limited range, can only operate in certain weathers, and the range is even further reduced if you wanted to carry a particularly large bomb. And obviously it can only be up in the air for a short amount of time, all of which makes their offensive capability somewhat disputable. And then if you look forward to what could Langley, once she's been recommissioned, be equipped with, again, she can be armed with bombs that can cause annoying damage, but not really all that much else, and her ability to search, etc., is limited. Now, if you compare that to an airship like Shenandoah or R-32, these craft can, one, carry a bomb load that's in excess of even the biggest, heaviest bomber available at the time, if they need to attack something. And that means not only can they carry some really, really big stuff, but they can also carry numerous smaller bombs if required. But also they are much, much better recon platforms than late 1910s - early 1920s aircraft. They can stay in the air a lot longer. In theory, they can operate in worse weathers. They can operate at night, which carrier-based aircraft in the early 1920s really weren't capable of doing. They can, to a certain degree, depending on the height of the weather systems, fly above the weather. They're massively longer range. They can stay airborne for days at a time, and obviously that means they can range out further. They can not just range out further from the coast, they can range out further from the fleet if you can arrange for some kind of at-sea refueling for them. And there's plenty of hilarious pictures to show that was definitely tried at various points. So as a recon platform, not perhaps necessarily as an attack platform, albeit their overall payload is larger, but certainly as a recon platform, which is what the primary identified capability of carrier aircraft is right at the start of the 20s, the airship is on paper a far superior thing to be using. Now, of course, as torpedo bombers come in, they're already in existence over in the UK, but as they come in the US, and as aircraft capabilities improve over the 20s and into the 30s, they obviously catch up to and overhaul the utility of the airship in this regard. But at the time that the money is being invested, as a long-range recon platform, there's not really much that can beat an airship. Rob McKelwee asks, at the height of its power before and up to the Battle of Trafalgar, what was the main makeup of the Royal Navy battle line? How many first-rate, second-rate and third-rate ships were in service? Now, it is, as always, something of a moving target, since Royal Navy ships were coming into commission and going out of commission all the time. New builds, ships going into reserve, ships going out of reserve, the occasional ship that was lost in battle, or more commonly ships that were lost due to the weather, primarily wrecks and so forth. But there is this poster, which you can see there. It's actually a colour one, but this is a black and white copy, which actually reads out the number of rated ships in commission with the Royal Navy in 1804, so this is just a year before the Battle of Trafalgar. And it makes for some quite surprising reading, because there are, hundreds of ships in service, the majority of which are fifth rates and sixth rates, and some smaller ships. There is a corresponding poster from, I think, either 1812 or 1814, which is obviously quite useful for reference for the War of 1812. But in 1804, I'll read out the first rates and second rates, and then I'll just tell you the number of third rates. But I'll give you the numbers first, actually. So there are 10 first rates in 1804, 21 second rates, so that's a total of 31 three-decker ships, and then no less than 157 third rates, ranging from 80 gunners, all 80 and 84 gunners, all the way down to a couple of 60 gunners, and the majority being 74s. So combined, there's just a little bit under 200 ships of the line, i.e. ships that you would see in battle. But of course, they're scattered across the world and in various states of repair. But so for your information, in 1804, the ships listed are first rates Caledonia, Hibernia, San Josef, Salvador del Mundo, Queen Charlotte, Ville de Paris, Britannia, Royal George, Royal Sovereign, and Victory. So obviously Salvador del Mundo and San Josef are both captured Spanish 112 gunners. Ville de Paris, I think at this point, was possibly a new build named after Ville de Paris that was captured, or it may have been an Océan class that was captured. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it was either a capture or related to a capture. I know the Royal Navy did build a Ville de Paris after the captured one rotted out. In any case, he also had the 98 gunner second rates and one or two 90 gunners, and those were the Barfleur, Boyne, Dreadnought, Formidable, Glory, Impregnable, London, Neptune, Ocean, Prince, Prince George, Princess Royal, Prince of Wales, Queen, St George, Sandwich, Temeraire, Union, Windsor Castle, Namur, and Sussex, with the biggest third rate being the Malta of 84 guns, along with the Royal William of 84 guns. Then there's a bunch of 80 gunners, not most, but a lot of which are captures, and then huge numbers of 74 gunners, a surprising number of 64s, considering that they were considered obsolete by this point, and then that's capped off by Medway and Ripon, which are a pair of 60 gunners at the lower end of the third rates. So hopefully that provides some insight as to just exactly what the strength of the Royal Navy was around the time of the Battle of Trafalgar. Ent1610 asks, how good would Shinano be if she was converted in the same way as Kaga, with a big hangar on top of the hull, and if she had been present at the Battle of Leyte in the above-mentioned configuration, would the battle have gone differently? Okay, well, second part of the question first. Shinano in any configuration at Leyte basically just means there's more targets for the US Navy, because as we'll go on to see, Shinano at full carrier capacity could probably actually carry more aircraft than the Japanese had available at Leyte Gulf. So in terms of if Shinano had been completed as a full-on fleet carrier as opposed to this weird hybrid self-escorting support carrier for a carrier battle group that no longer existed, she could have actually had quite an impressive capacity. Now, she is obviously the biggest, heaviest carrier in World War II, but she is not actually as long as that might imply. Lexington and Saratoga are actually longer than Shinano. The difference is that both Lexington and Saratoga have relatively fine battlecruiser hulls. Shinano is, of course, a converted Yamato-class battleship, which means she has a much larger beam, and that beam is consistent along a considerably larger portion of her length. The fact that she's still basically carrying her Yamato-scale armour scheme also contributes to the fact that she displaces a colossal amount. So, you can take off several thousand tons in armour plate, and it doesn't actually materially affect her qualities as a carrier other than slowing her down a bit. But nonetheless, if we're just looking at terms of her hangar and flight deck, one of the her limitations at the size that she is that she only actually has 2 lifts. But I suppose if you were going to complete her as a full-size carrier, then as a full carrier, then you could put another lift or 2 in, which wouldn't be too bad. The other thing is, her hangar space. Now, her hangar, again, if you compare to the Lexingtons, her hangar is actually longer than the Lexingtons, which is, again, a product of the fact that she remains beamier for more of her length. And it's also much, much wider. At its maximum width compared to Lexington's maximum width, you could easily fit another row of aircraft down one side of the hangar in the additional width that Shinano has. So Shinano's hangar is well over 100 feet wide. I think it's not like 111 feet or something like that, whereas Lexington's is 70 something foot at the most. So you've got kind of 25 to 30 plus feet of additional width, and that adds up to a lot. So when you consider that in her configuration as she was, Shinano was supposed to carry 40 aircraft of her own, plus another 120 aircraft not boxed up, but for flying off to other carriers. So that implies that actual carrier capacity of Shinano was about 160 aircraft, which, that kind of makes sense given the additional width and just, the sheer size of her hangar space. But of course, that would run into a few problems, one of which is that, as the Essexes and the Midways proved, it's actually pretty much impossible to operate more than about 100 aircraft at any one time off of a World War II configuration carrier. There's, it's too much. And also, as mentioned at the beginning, I doubt the Japanese had 160 carrier-trained pilots available by the time of Leyte Gulf that they could all put into one place. So, theoretically being able to carry 160 aircraft, even if we ignore the operational issues, the Japanese probably just flat out couldn't supply that many, fully armed, equipped, and piloted carrier aircraft by the point that Shinano entered service. But it does raise one interesting question. which is something that I've mentioned previously when you talk about something like an incomparable class carrier conversion as well. Basically, once you get to these hilariously oversized potential carrier conversions for the World War II period, if it's known that this is what's going to happen ahead of time, and if the nation in question has the resources, the optimal solution to dealing with a carrier that actually can carry far more aircraft than you're ever going to need is, well, either having a massive pool of reserve aircraft, or using the fact you have an extremely large, extremely strong carrier to develop much larger attack aircraft. That, you don't necessarily want to develop larger attack fighters, because fighters need to be fast and agile, but the idea of small, compact, twin-engine dive bombers and torpedo bombers that can either move significantly faster than their single-engine counterparts, and or can carry significantly larger payloads, that might be very attractive. Of course, that would rely on that would then have the Japanese would have to then come up with some kind of carrier-based twin-engined aircraft, but something that carries 2 or 3 torpedoes, or in the Japanese case, 1,000 or 1,500 or 2,000 pound bomb or 2, instead of 550-pounders and single torpedoes. That might increase the overall lethality, albeit that you could make the most lethal, theoretical, on paper reasonable carrier of the entire war with Shinano, and it's still not going to do a tremendous amount, because by the time she's in service, even if she's carrying 100 aircraft, of which, let's say, 50 are fighters and another 50 are extremely high-speed, twin-engine, 3 torpedo apiece torpedo bombers, the US just goes, yeah, that's nice, have a dozen Essexes to the face. The Arclight asks, how important was Malacca Strait in World War II? In grand overall terms, the Battle of Malacca Strait, aka the sinking of the Haguro, was not exactly the most ground-shaking of things. It finished off one of Japan's last remaining cruisers, so that, in as much as it means there was basically a clean sweep in terms of making sure that Japan had no operational heavy cruisers left, I suppose you can tick that one off the bucket list. But ultimately, Haguro's mission at that point kind of betrayed how much on the ropes the Japanese Navy was. She was, as you can see, a heavy cruiser, but by this point in her life she'd been reduced to supply ship and transport ship duties, initially taking supplies to various garrisons and then making several abortive attempts to sail from Singapore to remove various garrisons in the face of the oncoming Allied advance. Her orders were, where at all possible, to completely avoid fighting Allied vessels, and it had taken a couple of goes for the Allies to actually pin her down, because every time she was spotted, she either went back home or changed course to try and get back home, and in fact she was trying to get back to Singapore after a second attempt at her mission, because the Allied destroyers that were closing in on her had been spotted, and so she went, nope, I'm not fighting them, I'm going home, through the Malacca Strait, except for the fact that this time the Allies, under, hilariously enough, Captain Manly Power again, had anticipated exactly where Haguro and Kamikaze, her escort, was likely to go, and they were just waiting for her, and then they sank her. So it was a nice little action. It was a good, extremely good demonstration of the technological superiority that the Allies held by this point, because even destroyers at this point, and these aren't the big pre-war destroyers, these are S-class and V-class war emergency flotilla destroyers, even they have surface search radar that's able to lock onto Haguro at extremely long range at night, and then allows the destroyer flotilla to deploy in a perfect ambush position, which means they get the drop and are able to put multiple torpedoes into Haguro, and Haguro really isn't able to do all that much to stop them other than slightly damaging Samurats. A heavy cruiser sunk and the escorting destroyer damaged in exchange for some minor damage to one wartime emergency flotilla destroyer. Nick Priebe, or Priebe, I think, possibly, asks, I've read that Admiral Hart of the Asiatic Fleet was thought very highly of his submarines and was one of the early believers of his frustrated sub-captains in regards to complaints about the Mark 14 torpedo, despite having worked on the infamous Mark 6 exploder, and thus oversaw or was at least kept abreast of the unofficial testing reports. Is this true? I've also seen some criticise Hart for his handling of the Asiatic Fleet submarine arm before and immediately after the start of the war. Do you feel this is an accurate criticism, and is the criticism of pre-war training and preparation more a matter of Hart's personal hand or Navy doctrine? Now, with regards to Admiral Hart and the Mark 14, I'd have to do some further reading in detail as to his exact involvement in its development, if any, and also obviously how he dealt with the issue when it was affecting his submarines of the Asiatic Fleet. However, when it comes to his handling of the submarine section before and during the early stages of the war, I don't think I can really fault Hart all that much. The thing is, an awful lot of the criticism that is levelled at Hart, when you trace it back, ultimately comes from MacArthur, who, as regular viewers of this channel will know, is not exactly number one on my list of unbiased or reliable sources as to anything that happened in the South Pacific in World War II. Hart, of all the officers involved in the early part of World War II in the Pacific, navally, was probably one of the most aggressive and had one of the best plans. He knew from the start that there was very little chance that the Asiatic Fleet could actually stop the Japanese, but he had a pretty solid plan on delaying them. It's as good as anything else you can reasonably have come up with at the time. And unlike MacArthur, he actually had most of his fleet deployed before the Japanese attacked on what was, locally speaking, December the 8th. As opposed to, MacArthur's US Army Air Force, which was largely caught on the ground. Now, granted, there were some vessels still in harbour, and they were therefore lost when the Japanese showed up, having pretty much destroyed the Air Force presence in the Philippines and happily bombed the US Navy ships at anchor for a couple of hours without anything in the way of fighter opposition. But it could have been a lot worse. He had moved a bunch of torpedoes away, so there were still torpedoes of questionable value, obviously, but there were still physically torpedoes around, and his submarines did try to do as much damage as they possibly could. The only problem was, of course, they were largely equipped with the Mark 14s, and even the older boats that had the Mark 10s, the Mark 10s still had issues with running deep, albeit that once that was identified, that was much more easily corrected than the arm-length list of issues the Mark 14 had. But any chance that Hart's plan had of delaying the Japanese was really put paid to by the fact that, he could have had the most perfect plan in existence and it still wouldn't have helped him, because the torpedoes just flat out refused to kill anything. Apart from, their own subs, by alerting the Japanese that, hey, there's a submarine over here that just fired a torpedo at you. So, yeah, I don't think Hart can be criticised too much for what happened to the Asiatic Fleet's submarine arm. Yes, could he have done better? Yeah, in hindsight, 2020, it's always possible to do slightly better. But for the job that he was landed at the time he was landed it, I think he did as good a job as one could reasonably expect him to do. And the main downfall of it was factors outside of his control. Ironically enough, for all the fact that MacArthur, whined and stamped his feet about the Navy apparently running away and the Army and leaving the Army on the Philippines, the Navy's plan and the Army's plan for about a decade in the run-up to 1942 had been for the Navy to withdraw from the Philippines once the fighting got too close. So, if MacArthur didn't know that, well, I'm sorry, that's MacArthur's fault, because MacArthur clearly hadn't bothered to read, the several feet thick stacks of pre-war plans and preparations and exercises that had been going on all throughout the 1930s. And to stack, if you like, insult on top of injury, There was exactly one US Navy officer who advocated actually sticking around longer than the plan said to stick around and actually fighting out with the Japanese, even though the majority of his ships had non-functional weaponry, and that was Admiral Hart. But he was directly overruled from above when by everyone else saying, well, for one thing, obviously at the time, for whatever reason, your submarines aren't being as effective as we thought they were going to be. And also, at this point, there's going to be very few, if any, anchorages left for you. So if you stick around, you're just going to die pointlessly. So no, you can't do that. You have to, fall back to other places. Which, of course, being a good officer, he complied with. So, yeah, I think he really was given the short end of the stick by the position he was in. And he made a reasonably good best job of it as much as he could. But as I say, the specific details of how he interacted with the Mark 14 and its Mark 6 detonator, etc., is something I'd have to look at separately. Ethan Hatcher asks, how did they remount guns during the Age of Sail? Would they tie the guns down for the remainder of the cruise? Well, the first thing you've got to hope is that whatever dismounted the gun didn't affect the gun itself, so maybe a low cannonball smashed the carriage irreparably and the gun fell off. Okay. Now you've got to consider what's the weight of the gun, because it could be a 9-pounder, it could be a 12-pounder, it could be an 18, a 24, or a 32, or something else. And that's going to make a huge difference, because a 9 or 12-pounder might weigh somewhere between a ton and a half. A 24-pounder weighs 2.5 tons, and a 32-pounder still more than that. So, that's going to dictate hugely how many people are needed. But assuming that you wanted to remount it, and you could, short answer is yes, you could, then you'd have to get the ship's carpenter to make you a new gun carriage, which would probably involve salvaging a good chunk of the gun carriage that just got shot to pieces, and adding a few bits in to replace the bits that are broken. But in any case, assuming that you have the gun carriage, if you just want to do it the brute force and ignorance way and just deadlift the thing into place, then, well, the average gun crew, bearing in mind the average gun crew is anywhere between 12 and 16 men, can probably comfortably reseat a 9 or 12-pounder, maybe an 18-pounder. But if you're talking about a 24 or a 32-pounder, or most of the 18-pounders for that matter, you're going to need more than one gun crew. But fortunately, a ship of the line has plenty of men, so in brute force and ignorance terms, it would in theory be possible, if you had a gun carriage ready to go, to get enough men with enough support props and everything to just deadlift a gun back onto a carriage. However, you don't have to just use brute force and ignorance. Bear in mind, the ship has various mounting points for moving things around, whether that be boats or supplies, etc., etc. So if you can get a bunch of people to drag the gun into a position where it can be lashed up, then you can obviously lift it with many fewer people. You've also got the option of not actually necessarily lifting the gun completely. You could have a still reasonable size but smaller group of people lift one end of the gun, then you roll the carriage underneath into place and then lower it into position, so you're never having to actually lift the entire weight of the gun. So you could remount guns during the Age of Sail at sea in a variety of different ways, but to be perfectly honest, if you are in a position where you have many guns dismounted, that means you've probably been in a battle, which means your ship's probably been heavily damaged, which in turn means either your ship's been captured, in which case you don't need to bother, or your ship has, as I said, has been heavily damaged in battle, in which point you would be heading into port, where, again, the availability of cranes and so forth would make the whole job a lot easier. There would be a very narrow niche window in which you would be trying to remount any significant number of guns while you were actually still at sea. And no, you wouldn't tie the guns down for the remainder of the cruise. You'd just get someone to go down below decks to the rope locker and bring up some ropes and relash the thing into a position as necessary. Torreno asks, I was reading about the history of U-505 prior to her capture and saw that the submarine would frequently return to port after only a few days at sea. gaining a bit of a poor reputation that I feel probably contributed to Captain Zex's suicide on her 10th patrol. Whilst U-505's issues seem to stem from genuine issues, has there ever been a time when a captain or other crew members have conspired to keep a ship unduly out of harm's way, such as returning to port unnecessarily, or just sailing around an empty patch of ocean to avoid combat? The only other case I can think of is HMS Canopus, where the chief engineer who faked engine troubles prior to the Battle of Coronel, so I assume it's uncommon. So yes, there actually are a surprising number of instances where this kind of thing takes place, where either some element of the crew or the captain deliberately avoids action, but the reason it doesn't seem so common is that it is, relatively speaking, uncommon in what you might term the modern era, in the 20th century, but the further back in time you go, the more common it becomes, and usually it's mitigated by one of two things: either a wholesale change in the way the Navy in question operates, or just the increasing professionalism of the crew, because obviously most naval crews are made up of professionals of one sort or another, to some extent, through time. But if you compare the crew of a ship in the 17th or 18th century, which might consist of dedicated sailors and people who'd signed up because they had nothing better to do, as well as people who'd been press ganged and so on and so forth, as compared to the all-volunteer services, which pretty much make up most navies in the 20th century, albeit not all, then obviously the latter have somewhat less motivation to deliberately sabotage things than some elements of the former. But also there's also a sliding scale of how well those people are being treated. Are they being paid enough? Are their rations good enough, etc.? I.e., do they feel motivated to actually go out and fight people? So as you go further back in time, you'll find instances of this increasing. And also, the ways in which it could be done could be a lot more subtle back then. So if you were, let's say, a frigate or a single ship of the line or something, and your captain says, right, we're going to chase down that mysterious sail, if the crew feel they're being unduly harshly treated, or they haven't been paid for a while, or the food is terrible, or for whatever reason they're feeling fairly disaffected, it's not that difficult for them to, just do not quite enough to set the sails in such a way that they can actually catch their target. So they might be very slowly closing on it, but it's going to take so long to close on it that either the ship's going to go off station, or the enemy ship's going to reach safe harbour, or it's just not all. My night might fall and you lose sight of it. Absolute tragedy, of course, but what can you do? How do you prove that afterwards? If all the people who are up in the rigging swear, oh no, we did our absolute best, it's just for whatever reason the ship wasn't cooperating that day, what's the captain on the deck going to do to try and disprove that? Obviously you have to have a certain critical mass of people in order to pull that kind of thing off, but it can be done. You also had in a variety of engagements, especially again using the example of the early 17th century Royal Navy, various engagements where an admiral might lead his ships into an attack, but his various subordinates, commodores, vice admirals, etc., who may just not like him or may disagree with his tactics and think themselves better than him, and as a result you end up with ships just not going into support. And you legitimately have battles where the vanguard, perhaps with the admiral aboard, will charge into a French formation, and then the centre and the rear will just kind of sit just outside of gun range, making vague excuses for why they're not engaging yet, which then leads to an indecisive engagement and a lot of angry letters and court-martials back home. And sometimes it's difficult to prove what's going on and they get away with it. Other times it's much easier to prove exactly what's going on and people get censured for it. And then usually the rules of engagement are rewritten to force them to engage, and things such as this. But, say, a combination of tightening up those rules, ships becoming a lot more predictable in their behaviour, and generally speaking an improvement in paying conditions, means that once you get into the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the idea of parts of a ship's company or a ship's crew deliberately obfuscating things so that the ship doesn't enter a fight becomes significantly rarer. Lord Nelson asks, how was half pay calculated? I ask because I recently learned that the pay for officers differed not only by rank but also by the size of the ship they served on, i.e. the captain of a 74 would earn more than the captain of a frigate, even if the said frigate captain was senior than him on the list. If put ashore, would both captains earn the same half pay? So once you got ashore onto half pay, things became slightly simpler to calculate. Because yes, whilst pay could vary, especially for officers, depending on what size of ship they were on, once you were ashore, it basically dropped back to what's your rank and what's your seniority. And it wasn't massively complicated. So if you were a full admiral, you had a certain rate of pay. If you were a vice admiral or a rear admiral, you'd have a different rate of half pay. Of course, when they still had admirals, vice admirals or rear admirals of the red, white and blue, then those would have their own ranks. Commodores, obviously. But then when you got to things like captain, it was basically senior captain and captain, and then lieutenants or lieutenants as they were in the Royal Navy. You had it divided up into a few categories based on seniority, and that it wasn't necessarily by number of years. It was at certain points literally just things like the 100 most senior lieutenants on half pay get this, the next 300 get this, and everybody else gets this. So it was relatively speaking arbitrary. So you could have, I don't know, if you had 10 years service as a lieutenant, you might be in the top 100, but there might be a guy who has 9 years, 11 months service, and he's the 101st most senior lieutenant in the Royal Navy, but he gets the second tier. And the guy below him might only have been in for 5 years as a lieutenant, but he would also get the second tier. So it was a lot more cut and dried, complicated only, of course, by people being promoted, even while they were on half pay, people dying, people being discharged out of the Navy and so forth, which might cause you to move up and down a bit if you happen to be on the borderlines of things, if you're on a long period of half pay. But more directly, if you had a captain of a frigate and a captain of a 74 gunner put ashore, then assuming they weren't at one of these sort of margins of change, then if the frigate captain was a couple of years senior to the captain of the 74, but they were both within the same overall large bracket, then yes, they would be paid basically the same. Sam Signorelli asks, I believe you've said the Mediterranean wasn't really suitable for large carrier operations. Why? It's a few thousand miles across, so it's not really a small body of water. The problem specifically for carrier operations in the Mediterranean in World War II is simply that the area, yes, the Mediterranean is a relatively large operational area, but the bits that you really want to be conducting carrier ops around are the bits where the enemy is, and therefore where the enemy can contest you. There's no point in doing carrier ops out of, just 50 miles east of Gibraltar, because apart from giving, Franco's Spain a little bit of an air show, you're not really going to accomplish much other than maybe looking out for the odd U-boat. And similarly, if you're conducting flight ops off of, the Syrian coast, as once you've dealt with the Vichy French presence there, obviously, again, you're not really impressing anyone. If you're going to be conducting carrier ops in any meaningful way, shape or form, you either have to be conducting them just off of shore of the North African coast in the area where either the Italians at the beginning or the Africa Corps later on and the Italians are operating. And then you also have the Italian peninsula itself, and then once Greece has fallen, and Crete, those areas as well, all of which have land-based aircraft on them. The most common use of carriers in the Mediterranean on a large scale was, of course, convoy escorts to keep Malta resupplied and so on and so forth, all of which you're going to be talking about contested airspace. Now, to give you some idea of just how contested that airspace is, in August 1942 you have Operation Pedestal. Pedestal is one of the biggest attempts that the Allies make to get convoy to Malta, and it involves, amongst other things, multiple aircraft carriers, albeit some of them were acting as aircraft ferries only, and admittedly some of them were not carrying the world's largest air groups either. But nonetheless, when you compare it to, say, something like Midway. Now, Midway, the Japanese had almost the entire Kido Butai there, minus the Shokakus, and they managed to field a total of just under 250 aircraft, split between dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighters. And obviously they didn't get to use a bunch of those either, and that battle still cost the Americans the Yorktown. The Americans had slightly more aircraft, but not a huge amount more, and it cost the Japanese the entirety of the Kido Butai that was present at the time. And that's factoring in, the Hornets aircraft basically contributed little to the overall engagement, and Midway's aircraft also were not particularly effective. So, that's the kind of losses that a few hundred aircraft can inflict, but out of those few hundred aircraft, you actually look at the number that actually launched anything approximating a successful attack, and it's remarkably small. A few dozen aircraft actually, of all those 500 plus aircraft present in and around Midway, a few dozen of them actually get to pull off any kind of significant attack, and with those few dozen aircraft on either side carrying out the attacks, you get all the losses that you get at Midway. Now compare that to Pedestal, and for Pedestal, the Germans and the Italians assemble more bombers than whichever side at Midway you want to pick had aircraft total. And those bombers can include not just single-engined bombers that have to be designed to the specifications and limitations of carrier operations. They can also include large multi-engined bombers that are capable of going much further and carrying much heavier payloads. And on top of that, they also managed to assemble over 300 fighter aircraft. So the total forces assembled by the Axis to oppose Pedestal on the land-based airfields in southern Italy and so forth, basically put together, add up to pretty much more than every single aircraft present at the Battle of Midway on both sides combined. On top of the fact, as mentioned earlier, that a good chunk of these aircraft are going to be more capable aircraft in terms of range and payload than the carrier-based aircraft that you would tend to find at Midway, outside of, obviously a few twin-engine aircraft based on Midway Island itself. Now, on top of that is the fact that airfields don't tend to sink very easily. And so, unlike with the Japanese, if they lose their carriers, a lot of their aircraft are pretty stuffed as well. Factor in on top of that, it's much easier to scramble multiple sets of aircraft from multiple airfields, and even for aircraft of comparable otherwise performance, like say a Stuka versus a Kate or a Val, the Stukas, as long as the enemy target is within range, can fly with a considerably heavier payload because they have a considerably longer runway in order to get airborne. And then in terms of going round again, obviously an airfield can have considerably more in the shape of anti-aircraft defences and fighter defences than a carrier is usually going to have. Plus, when those strike aircraft land, they taxi off of the runway and they can be happily refueled and rearmed, and the crews can be rested and they can be made ready to go around again. Whereas on a carrier, you have to land everybody, which is a bit more of a fraught exercise in the first place, and then you have to take them down below using your elevators, which limits the rate at which you can transfer aircraft, and then you have limited stores of ammunition, limited stores of fuel, and limited room in which to rearm them and stack them all back up on deck again, and so on and so forth. There's just a lot more room to maneuver on an airfield. And this kind of shows when you look at Pedestal, because there's near enough 600 aircraft ranged against them, but those aircraft are able to fly strike formations well over 100 strong, arriving in multiple waves, each wave being 30 to 40 aircraft. And those strike waves are able to be launched 2 to 3 times a day for multiple days. And, that is something that carriers of the time just cannot really stand against. No matter how good the carrier is, no matter how many aircraft it's carrying, any reasonable force of carriers, they can maybe launch at this kind of the time period the Mediterranean is a hot zone. You can expect a carrier to launch maybe a really big strike using most of its aircraft complement twice in a day, not 3 times. And, you're being attacked by, let's say, approximately 300 aircraft a day. So you're basically facing the equivalent attack of a 6-strong carrier group, a 6 fleet carrier strong attack force, but with aircraft with, again, longer range and higher payloads, and probably, somewhat better fighter aircraft, except that you can't do anything to sink these, and if you shoot down a bunch of them, they have a ton of replacements, and they're going to come back the day after, and the day after, and the day after that. Whereas even if you were facing a 6-strong carrier group, the chances of all of them combining and getting a force off of that kind of size is relatively small. But even if they did, there's a finite number of those carrier aircraft. So the more of them you shoot down, the more of the carriers that you sink, etc., the less aircraft are going to come back after you. And obviously, when you when the next day dawns, eventually those carriers are going to start running out of spare parts and ammunition and fuel and so forth. The air bases don't tend to do that. So you can have carrier operations that will cover a specific formation, or might launch a specific strike, but they are very much operating at the sufferance of incoming land-based aircraft. So you hope you're not spotted. Your cap is largely tasked with shooting down reconnaissance aircraft so that they don't tell the enemy where you are. And if an attack comes in, it's mostly a case of, shoot down as many as you can, break up the attack as best you can, and then start dodging and relying on your anti-aircraft gunfire and hope for the best. Now, compare that, as I said, to the Pacific, where you basically go in, you engage for a day, maybe 2, and then you withdraw. The Mediterranean is an entirely different kettle of fish. Now, that's not to say you couldn't eventually pull off large-scale carrier ops in the Mediterranean if you had enough carriers, but for the most part, when the Mediterranean is a contested war zone, there are considerably more Axis aircraft available, with all the caveats that I just mentioned, than there are going to be carrier-based aircraft available. And if you're in a position where you can flood the Mediterranean with enough carriers to just go and stand toe-to-toe with the land-based air forces and beat them in a war of attrition, well, you've already won, because the industrial might to back that up means that you are considerably more powerful than the opposition, by an order of magnitude already, which is nothing really to do with the suitability of carriers versus land bases in a long-term attritional warfare, and simply due to the fact you have, as far as it makes no difference, nigh on infinitely more resources. And finally, Patrick Donnelly asks, had the US Navy delayed laying down the keel of USS Wasp from 1936 to 1937 or 38, could they have built her as a full Yorktown-class carrier within the terms of the Second London Naval Treaty, as the terms of the Washington Treaty had expired on December 31st, 1936? Technically speaking, yes. It would have been possible to do, because the Second London Treaty allowed the conditions of Washington and First London in terms of overall tonnage limitations to lapse. Now, it did impose some rather stringent conditions on what kind of ships you could build, not just in terms of 35,000-ton battleships and so forth, but it also basically ruled out certain types of ship entirely. There was a rather intricate set of clauses, for example, that effectively meant the only cruisers that could be built were 8,000 tonners with 6-inch guns. You weren't allowed to have any what we would define now as treaty type heavy cruisers, and the sort of immediate super cruiser block that might be immediately suggested above that was also completely kind of blocked out, assuming that everybody stuck to it. So, I think it was basically aiming to have the minimum allowable threshold for capital ships to be high enough that you would effectively be creating a small, cheap battleship, but one that was too expensive to build in very large numbers and too vulnerable to be worth building. But, as related to carriers, the displacement limit on aircraft carriers would allow for a Yorktown to be built, and without the overall displacement limitations in terms of collective displacement, then sure, if Wasp had been delayed into 1937, then assuming that you could persuade Congress to part with the extra money, you could have built her as another Yorktown class or variant thereof. And that brings us to an end for this week's Drydock. Thank you very much for listening, everybody. Hope you're having a good week, and hope you will have a good week to come. So hopefully I will see you again in another video. Bye.